In this session, we're going to take a look at producing effective bracketed exposures when using Enfuse for Lightroom. Enfuse is a really useful plugin that will enable you to create a high dynamic range image from a series of bracketed exposures. And it does this, in my opinion, a lot more elegantly than some of the other methods for producing full HDR blending. The colours are very natural and the result is really pretty effective. It can't, however, cope with really extreme situations of light and dark. So in this session I'm going to give you a few tips on producing the most effective bracketed exposures to work with the program. So I've got an image selected here which shows the typical problem of a fairly well exposed interior at the expense of the view through the windows. And the view through the window from a real estate point of view is something that's important and sellable. And my final shot should include detail in that area. So if I was to expose in order to harness detail in the exterior view, that of course leads to blocked up shadows and a really unreadable interior. But by shooting a sequence of brackets at different exposures, I can ensure that that series of images contains detail from the very light to the very dark portions of my image. So looking a little more closely at this series of bracketed exposures, if we start at the darkest one, and you can press I on your keyboard, and that will bring up first of all the dimensions of the picture and the date taken, but much more useful if you press I again, you'll get the shutter speed used and the apertures, etc., and the lens used. And you'll see here that my aperture has remained constant. If I scroll through the brackets, the aperture remains constant at f11, and what's changing are the shutter speeds, which I'm increasing in full stop increments. So I'm going all the way down to my final exposure of 30 seconds at f11. The reason for keeping the aperture constant is that if I was to bracket with my aperture, then my depth of field would change from bracket to bracket. So I'm bracketing just with the shutter speed, and I'm just working with the ambient light. I'm not using any fill flash in this shot. Now you may be tempted to think, well, why don't we just run a 10-stop bracket that goes from the very dark to the very light, run it through Enfuse and all be well and good. Unfortunately, that's asking a lot of Enfuse. It's asking it to encapsulate a really wide tonal range if you run such a wide series of brackets. So the fine art to using Enfuse is discovering how much you can overexpose and underexpose in your brackets and still get a good result. So what's important here is to contain enough detail in my shadow areas. So I'm going to definitely include this bracket. This is the longest of all, the 30-second one, and I've got some nice detail on this unlit side of the sofa, and I'm going to stick with that one. So going through my selection, I'll obviously have this one and this one and this one. And round about here, this is where it gets critical, because what I'm looking for is the bracket that includes just enough textural detail in the garden area and this bit of flooring here. And as I mentioned before, the temptation might be to just use that shot that I know I've got it all safely contained. But that's going to make life really difficult if you imagine Enfuse is going to try and blend this really dark area here. So if I was to use that one, I've still got a certain amount of tonality coming up in the shadow areas, and I've got just about enough detail here in the highlight areas. So that would enable me to include 5 exposures as part of my blended series rather than the 7 that I shot. So if I select these 5 images and run them through the Enfuse software, if you'd like to watch one of my other videos, it'll tell you specifically how to do this. The result we get is this image, which I hope you'll agree is a very nice rendition of the scene. We've got pretty good shadow detail here. I'm particularly pleased with the fact that it's very low in digital noise. Those shadow areas have come out with some nice bit depth attributed to them because of the overexposed file. For my liking, I'd like to see a little bit more detail, textural detail in these floor tiles here, but that can be done. And also sometimes I find when images come straight out of Infuse, they have a slightly soft look to them. They could do with a little bit more sparkle, and these tones in the wall here, I'd like to take those up a little bit. So with a few adjustments using the adjustment brush in Lightroom, I can actually take the image to this. And all I've done here is pass over that area, for example, with a negative highlight adjustment, just to pull some detail out of the TIFF file and create some texture in the floor tiles. I've also used a positive shadows adjustment and exposure adjustment to just lighten this area underneath the table. A little bit of lightening going on here and here, and I've also passed an adjustment brush over the wall and ceiling to just give a bit of sparkle to that area. It took a very short amount of time, and I've gone from there to there, and I hope you'll agree that's quite a nice presentable shot, which from a marketing point of view has plenty of information in the interior, certain amount of information showing the exterior, and it's all thanks to Infuse. I didn't use any flash here. In a future video I'm going to show you how to use Infuse in combination with a certain amount of fill flash, which will produce an even better result. But as a tried and tested way of getting a decent result with no flash equipment on site, I think it's very hard to beat.